I'm very honored to be appearing in this panel where I'll be in such good company and talking about these important topics. But I especially want to start by thanking Kat Harrison, who reminded us yesterday of the stream of knowledge that we are part of the value of the underground, of the gift that we received and must be shared, and of the role that elders are meant to have, which is to remind the younger generations of what's come before and the place that we hold in the greater design. With this said, today I'm going to try to speak very simply about very complex things. Indigenous knowledge, the medicalization of psychedelics, Maslow's hierarchy, the globalization of plant medicines. This means that I will have to compress by making generalizations, so please bear with me. These are a lot of complex topics, and I will try to express them, as I said, in very simple terms. I'll start by saying that for 20 years, I've been studying what indigenous people know, but we seem to have forgotten about the most powerful plants in the world. In this process, I've stood on the shoulders of giants who have lived and learned from indigenous people and who have built bridges between cultures and helped us understand better the treasure of knowledge that these traditions hold. A lot has been written about the stunning cultural and spiritual technologies of indigenous people. Often, especially when it comes to plant teachers, the focus has been on their cosmologies, on their spiritual and shamanic knowledge. While these arguments have resonated with people like me and other culturally sensitive and spiritually aware people, such as many of us here, it left materialistic people, the type of people who think that a mountain is nothing but a bunch of rocks, completely unimpressed. So it also confined indigenous cultures inside a certain box. Indigenous cultures as a source of cultural diversity and spiritual knowledge, but not as a source of pragmatic science. We think traditional cultures develop cosmologies, not technologies. So for many Westerners, they are seen as having a sort of folkloric interest, not as cultures that technically inclined Westerners could learn much from, much less scientists. But in my work, I will explain why later, I wanted to reach those people, the materialistic people. So I took a different perspective. I thought, what examples of indigenous feats of practical technical knowledge could I show them? Something like this. These are the Subak rice terraces in Bali, a 20,000 hectare system that has been feeding people for 1,000 years straight. Without chemical pesticides or fertilizers, without depleting the soil, without eroding the land. It's been recognized as an example of sustainability by UNESCO's World Heritage. None of our agricultural technologies could promise 1,000 years of soil fertility. Or something like this. These beautiful Khasi bridges in India. They are built in one of the most difficult territories to build structures, a mountainous rainforest where all wood rots, all metal rusts, and yearly monsoons make the rivers grow so large that they sweep all bridges away. Yet these bridges, every year, these bridges that you see get covered by very fast water. They get completely covered by water that is running very, very fast. And yet, instead of being swept away, every year they grow stronger. How? Because they're made of the only matter that survives in this environment, living matter. They're made out of roots, tree roots which are carefully weaved together into structures that grow with time and instead of eroding, and because the roots are so deep into the earth that can actually withstand the strongest possible currents and the growth of the rivers. So the point that I'm trying to make is that as long as we see traditional cultures only as a spiritual reservoir, and we miss their feats in technologies of sustainability, we're missing a big part of the picture. Both of these examples, by the way, are from a book called Low Tech, designed by Radical Indigenism, which I really recommend if you're interested in the topic. But now let's get back to white people. So Abraham Maslow, as many of you know, was an American psychologist who was very, very influential in what was later called humanistic psychology. He's best known for this pyramid, a hierarchy of human needs that he may put as a pyramid. So people first have physiological needs, they need food, etc. Then they need to feel safe and secure. Then they need to have love and belonging, and then it's self-esteem, and then on top of it, it's self-actualization. What Maslow was saying, among many other things, is that as long as the bottom of the pyramid is missing, if people don't feel safe, if people don't have food, it's very difficult for them to develop self-esteem or self-actualization. Humanistic psychologists believe that every person has a strong desire to become more and more what one is, to become everything that one is capable of becoming, realizing their full potential. This is what they mean by self-actualization. I think for many of us, it's better to understand in reverse. I think we all know that there's a certain sadness and misery that comes over people who are not able to live their potential by bringing out the gifts that they carry inside. Some decades later, this came out, and this is a commentary from indigenous Blackfoot tribe about how they understood the hierarchy of human needs. In this indigenous perspective, self-actualization is not at the top of the pyramid, but is actually at the bottom of the pyramid. And on top of that is community self-actualization, and on top of that is cultural perpetuity. So the highest calling in this pyramid is not for personal self-actualization, but to preserve the gifts of the land and of the people. They are trying to perpetuate a culture that will be a legacy for generations into the future by preserving the land and the people who hold the culture. They say, we want the land and the people to stay alive and the cultural gifts to stay alive so that they will feed our descendants for a long time. Until recently, this simple sentence has been true of every human group in the world throughout history. I would say it is even true of animals, plants, and fungi. We want to preserve the gifts of the land and the population so that this will be a legacy that will nourish the generations to come. It doesn't get any more basic, more universal, or more true than that. And when you think about it, it might be the simplest definition of sustainability that there is. Take the gifts that we have received and keep them alive for the generations to come. Now we get to psychedelics. So I said that for 20 years I've been studying what indigenous people know, and we seem to have forgotten about the most powerful plants in the world. What I found in this study is a pattern that will be all too familiar in this forum. In the past 500 years, many plant teachers of indigenous origin have become global. Tobacco was one of the first ones, followed by coca. Here we begin to see the pattern. The plants travel, but not the culture associated with them. Or if you want, the technology of sustainability associated with them. The result is that without these technologies, the plants seem to have the opposite effect on us than they had on traditional cultures. Tobacco, the undisputed king of American sacred plants, became for us the #1 source of preventable deaths worldwide. Coca, the leaf of life of the Andes, took over the world, split in two, cocaine on one side and Coca-Cola on the other, both bringing illness instead of health. Again and again, our use of these plants was nothing like the indigenous use. We separated the plants from the culture, and then we separated the molecules from the plants. With each step of separation, the harms seem only to increase for us, until the function of these sacred plants was inverted from plant medicines that bring life to toxic drugs that brings us harm, sometimes even death, until this happened. So this is an image of an ayahuasca ceremony. Now, is this taking place in the Amazon or 20 miles from here, somewhere? If it wasn't for the roof, it might be hard to tell. And that's precisely the point I'm trying to make here. A group of people outside the Amazon gather to drink ayahuasca. They will be led by a person who has more knowledge and experience than the rest, who gauges the dose, and who is responsible for the well-being of the group. This person or persons were usually engaged in some sort of ritual act, usually involving music, which will accompany and modulate the experience of the people. Now, if I was describing a traditional Amazonian ayahuasca ceremony in the Amazon jungle, from indigenous groups all the way to the Brazilian churches, every one of the elements I just mentioned would also be there. So there's something historically unique happening here that is not obvious at first sight, and is that people in the West are using ayahuasca in similar ways and for similar reasons as people in the Amazon, and this is a historical first. This had never happened before. So while many sacred plants from the Americas have been globalized, ayahuasca might be the first one that has brought some of its technology, the circle, the ceremony, the music. Ayahuasca came to us not as a substance, but as a culture. So what is the difference between pharmaceutical psychedelics and indigenous practice? I mean, it's all different, but among the difference, between, if you look at pharmaceutical psychedelics and indigenous practices, what they have in common is that they both touch on personal self-actualization, or if you want, on healing. But indigenous practices are also community actualization and cultural perpetuity. This is not just about how an individual gets healed. This is about how a culture is kept alive by gathering to be together and to care for one another. So while personal self-actualization is important, it is also easy to turn into a business, a therapeutic program, coaching, training, clinics, the self-help industry. Monetizing the inner drive for self-actualization is how we end up with what's being called psychedelic capitalism. On the other hand, community actualization and cultural actualization are not so easy to turn into businesses. And when we try, often it's not pretty. I will give two examples of recent attempts at monetizing community. One is the very extractive mega churches, and the other one is Facebook. So this is an issue. While self-actualization can be a good business, community self-actualization is a harder business. It might even be one of those human needs that business technologies simply cannot service well. So I Googled psychedelic therapy, and this is what came out as a result. And you know what I thought, looking at this, I thought, how sustainable is this? Recently, I visited a very, very nice ketamine clinic. The room, which had a very similar setup, except everything was much nicer than this. The room was much nicer. The walls were painted beautifully green. There was a tree on the back, nice bed. And then the person lay there, and there was one man therapist and one woman therapist on each side. And the sessions lasted about 4 hours. And, the person sat there with a mask and music, and the therapist sat by them. So it took between 4 or 6 hours per therapist, 2 therapists, 1 person, 6 hours. They could do 1 a day, and then they could do 4 a week, because maybe some emergency had to happen on Friday, right? So I thought, again, how sustainable is this? I mean, are these therapists going to be able to do this for 10 or 20 years? I mean, spend 6 hours a day, every week, sitting next to a person that occasionally needs help, but mostly doesn't? I mean, how long before they get bored? I mean, how long before they start saying, well, I do this every day, most of the time I'm not needed, let's put a camera on this. Or, let's put many people in many different rooms with many cameras, and I just look at a big screen, and I intervene if I'm needed, or, or maybe they can call me via Zoom, or maybe with artificial intelligence, somebody can keep track of something, and then, they only call me for the true emergencies. So I want to go back to this. Put aside, cosmological and spiritual aspects that we all know and appreciate, and ask a different question. What are the sustainability lessons that hardcore scientists and materialists can extract from ceremonial plant work, removing, the spiritual aspects? So first of all, I would say, do groups and not individuals. Because it's a hard work. And if you do it once and twice a week, then this might be more sustainable than if you have to do it every day, this work. So, do groups, so you can do this just a couple of times a week. Second, MDMA might be an exception, but in general, with psychedelics, don't talk to people while they are on the experience. It's not going to work, and it's not going to work well. Instead, live music that can accompany and guide them through the experience, but most importantly, that can adapt to the circumstances, unlike taking them through a preordained playlist that may not actually fit what they're feeling. Third, sometimes people in these states will need comforting. Do not hug them, hold their hands, put an arm around their shoulders. Everyday language of comfort might not be appropriate in these circumstances, and it might even be counterproductive. Instead, indigenous shamans comfort people by touching them without touching them. They touch them with a leaf fan, they touch them with a feather, with aromas, with tobacco smoke, with song. Understanding this lesson, Western therapists can avoid appropriation by developing their own language of caring for people during the experience that will be appropriate for our culture. And for God's sake, if this is going to be your profession and you're going to do this every day, you need to understand the experience the same way that a psychoanalyst cannot be a good psychoanalyst without having undergone years of psychoanalysis themselves. You need to understand the process you're guiding others through. Also, when the therapist takes a little bit of the medicine themselves, it's a lot less boring and more engaging for them, so they can do this work for years, and this is also more sustainable. So these are just examples of how we could be inspired by those who have so much more experience than us, to make our own practices more sustainable. Because the traditions are not just cultural treasures, they're also practical ones. They are treasures of sustainability if you know where to look and what to ask. So I hope we are now coming to the point where you can begin to understand why I have given so much of my life to the protection of ceremonial plant work outside of the countries of origin. Because with all its lights and shadows, and there are many, many problems with Western plant medicine circles, believe me, there are problems we deal with daily at ICERS, the foundation where I work. But despite these problems, there is something tremendously valuable here, a link, a living connection at the ground level to the source of sustainability, and at higher levels to much, much more. The plant underground is one of the few places in our culture where people remember that ritual is not performance, that altars are not decoration, that live music is sometimes the only way to codify messages meant for people experiencing psychedelics, and that personal transformation is most effective when accompanied by a community. Or in the reverse, the plant underground understands that maybe, just maybe, there are much better ways to take a psychedelic than in a hospital bed, away from nature, while listening to a pre-programmed playlist accompanied by someone with no direct experience of the medicine that they are sharing. Thank you. Sorry, there's one missing. So this is Maslow's pyramid again, and this is the Blackfoot reply, properly represented. It is not a pyramid, it's a teepee. Do you know why self-actualization is at the base of this pyramid? I mean, what happens to all these other things that Maslow spoke about? What about people eating, and what about safety, and what about love? I mean, where are those things gone if the base is self-actualization? Well, Maslow, before he developed this, Maslow had visited an indigenous community intending to test the universality of a theory that he was holding, that social hierarchies are maintained by dominance of some people over others. However, he did not see this quest for dominance in this indigenous community. Instead, he discovered astounding levels of cooperation, minimal inequality, restorative justice, full bellies, and high levels of satisfaction. He estimated that 80 to 90% of the tribe had a quality of self-esteem that was only found in 5 to 10% of the white population. Maslow saw a place where what he would later call self-actualization was actually the norm. This observation completely changed his trajectory. And that's the reason why it's missing from the pyramid, because it's implied, it's given. So, do you know what was the name of the indigenous group that Maslow visited? It was the Blackfoot, of course. So, again, I've said that I spent 20 years studying what indigenous people know, and we seem to have forgotten about the most powerful plants in the world. After traveling a lot and reading a lot, after considerable historical, social, economic forces, colonialism, capitalism, prohibition, the whole lot, I read up on all of it. And at the end, I've come to a very simple explanation of what is it that we have forgotten. We have forgotten to ask the right question. Traditional cultures do not ask, how can the effects of this plant help an individual self-realize? But rather, how can the effects of this plant be put at the service of the community? I will give an example. The practice of coca leaf chewing, for those of you that have tried it, is wonderful, has an effect that is both stimulating and relaxing. It gives one a sort of calm focus. When one wonders what can do with this effect, a self-actualizing Westerner will think of something like, well, I can work a lot more, I can stay up and drive all night, or I can even party all night. And these are the type of answers that we come to this question: what can this stimulus do for me? When indigenous people of the Amazon asked a different question of coca leaf, not what can it do for me, but how can what it does for me be used for the actualization of the community? The answer to that question was politics. Use coca in community gatherings. Why? Because a lot of politics is basically listening to other people. And listening to others is hard. It takes concentration, it's tiresome, and a plant that gives you calm focus is the perfect support for that. Use this energy, this gift, to listen to others. So you're not just caring for yourself, you're caring for the people, and when you care for the people, the practice turns pro-social instead of anti-social. It turns sustainable for the individual, for the community, for the culture, and for the generations to come. So after pondering what indigenous people know, and we seem to have forgotten about the most powerful plants in the world, I realized that what we have forgotten was never about the plants. It was simply about life, about how to live better with ourselves, with others, and with the world at large. This is the gift that we have received from the traditions, presented in an argument of sustainability that even hardcore materialists can understand. It's important for me they understand, because unfortunately, the materialists are going to have a large say on how the West decides to persecute or integrate ceremonial plant practices. So what comes after the psychedelic Renaissance? Historically, after the Renaissance came the Enlightenment. So if we are now in the psychedelic Renaissance, what would the psychedelic Enlightenment be like? I've thought a lot about this. I've been thinking about it for years. How do we make a future where there's a place not just for clinical use of psychedelic medicines, but for indigenous voices, for traditional plants, for community practice, and for non-medical applications of psychedelics? More and more, there's an obvious need for a companion, a counterpart to exist alongside the psychedelic clinics of the future. This counterpart is based on group and community uses instead of on individual ones. It is respectful of the traditions. It regulates spaces rather than substances or products. And it leverages the power of psychedelics as prevention tools rather than as treatment options. I want to stress that this vision is not oppositional to psychedelics' role in biomedical frameworks, but complementary to it, aimed at a deeper reflection that reaches beyond the limitations of medicalization, which are many, many, as we all know. Among other things, medicalization of any sort is not concerned with communities' actualization or protection of the culture. So what needs to happen between the Renaissance and between this present Renaissance and this future Enlightenment is a recognition by the materialists of the values of these practices. And this recognition would lead to more collaboration. Plant medicine facilitators can help today's psychedelic doctors a lot. Not with screening before, this is best left for doctors and pharmacologists, or with the integration after, which is probably best left to properly trained psychologists, but with the during, with the psychedelic experience itself, an experience that most classically trained doctors are at a loss on how to manage. And that's why they end up creating these sort of awful models, you know. And plant medicine facilitators have a lot of practical experience with. So this is our calling, how to help preserve this gift, which is not about ayahuasca per se, it's not even about the plants, traditional medicine, or indigenous knowledge. It's about sustainability. It's about preserving the gifts of the land and the people. It's about renewing the culture for generations to come. It's about getting back to being on the side of life and on the flow of life. How do we protect this gift? By uniting the people who also have the calling to preserve it, but don't know how to go about it. Lots of people feel this call. What we are doing, not just where I work, but in many other places, is to try to catalyze this calling by pointing out possibilities, because unrealized potential comes with deep sadness, and we believe this is how our talents are best put to use. Because, like every other living being, deep down, we cannot escape our calling and our responsibility to preserve the treasure that has been shared with us and the gifts of the land and the people. Thank you very much.